The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as families began setting up their picnic tables for Memorial Day. The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce filled the air, while kids ran around with small American flags clutched in their sticky fingers. This was how Millbrook had celebrated Memorial Day for over 30 years, and today felt no different from any other. Bobby Martinez arrived early, as he always did. At 68, he moved a bit slower than he used to, but he still carried himself with a certain dignity that made people notice him. His weathered hands gripped a small bouquet of white carnations as he walked toward the Veterans Memorial that stood at the center of the park. The same faded army cap sat on his gray head, and his old military jacket hung loosely on his thin frame. Most folks in town knew Bobby by sight, though few knew much about his story. He lived quietly in a small apartment above the old bookstore on Main Street, kept to himself and worked odd jobs around town when people needed help. He never caused trouble, always paid his bills on time, and had a gentle way with the stray cats that wandered the alley behind his building. The memorial ceremony wasn't scheduled to start for another hour, but Bobby liked to come early. He preferred the quiet moments before the crowd gathered, when he could stand alone with his thoughts and the names carved into the black granite stone. He placed his flowers at the base of the memorial and stood back, removing his cap and holding it against his chest. That's when Derek Walsh spotted him. Derek owned the biggest car dealership in town and considered himself something of a local celebrity. He had served 4 years in the National Guard back in the 90s, though he'd never been deployed overseas. Still, he wore his service like a badge of honor and appointed himself as the unofficial guardian of veteran affairs in Millbrook. Derek had organized the Memorial Day ceremony for the past 5 years, and he took the responsibility seriously. Well, Derek said loudly as he approached Bobby, his 2 buddies trailing behind him like faithful dogs. Look who's playing dress-up for Memorial Day. Bobby turned around slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion. He simply nodded at Derek and started to walk away, but Derek wasn't finished. Hold on there, old man. I'm talking to you. Derek's voice carried across the park, causing several families to look over. I've been meaning to ask you about that fancy jacket you're always wearing. Bobby stopped walking but didn't turn around. His shoulders tensed slightly, and his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. See, here's the thing, Derek continued, stepping closer. I know pretty much every veteran in this town. I organize the ceremonies, I run the fundraisers, I coordinate with the VFW, but you? I've never seen you at a single meeting. Never seen you at any veteran events. You just show up here once a year with your flowers and your costume. A small crowd was beginning to form, though most people kept their distance. Parents pulled their children closer, sensing the tension in the air. The cheerful sounds of the barbecue seemed muted now, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Bobby finally turned around, his brown eyes meeting Derek's challenging stare. I come to pay my respects, he said quietly. That's all. Pay your respects? Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. With what right? That jacket looks like something you bought at a surplus store. Those patches could be from anywhere. How do we know you didn't just decide to play soldier for attention? Bobby's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He started walking toward his old pickup truck, but Derek grabbed his arm. I'm not done talking to you, Derek snapped. You want to walk around this town pretending to be a hero? Fine, but not on Memorial Day. Not in front of real veterans and their families. The crowd was growing larger now. Someone had pulled out their phone and was recording. Children stared with wide eyes while their parents whispered among themselves. The festive atmosphere of the morning had completely evaporated. Let go of my arm, Bobby said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Or, what? Derek taunted. You'll call your army buddies? Oh wait, you probably don't have any because you were never actually in the army, were you? That's when something changed in Bobby's eyes. For just a moment, they went completely cold, like winter ice, and Derek actually took a step back. But the moment passed quickly and Bobby just looked tired again. I don't want any trouble, Bobby said. I just came to pay my respects to the fallen. The fallen? Derek's voice rose to a shout now. You mean the real soldiers? The ones who Actually served their country instead of buying fake medals and stolen valor? The crowd gasped at the accusation. Stolen valor was serious business, especially in a small town like Millbrook where military service ran deep in many families. Derek's two friends nodded along, emboldened by their leader's aggression. "Yeah," said Tommy Henderson, Derek's longtime drinking buddy. "I bet you can't even tell us what unit you served with." "Or where you were stationed," added Rick Murphy, the third member of their little gang. "Come on, if you're really a veteran, prove it." Bobby looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few showed sympathy, but all of them were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. "I don't have to prove anything to you," Bobby said finally. "My service is between me and my conscience." Derek laughed harshly. "Your conscience? That's rich. You know what, I think? I think you're a lonely old man who wanted some attention and respect, so you put on a costume and pretended to be something you're not." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Bobby stood there for a long moment, the carnations still, clutched in his other hand, now slightly crushed from the confrontation. The Memorial Day crowd watched in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or cruelty. Finally, Bobby spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about?" "Then prove me wrong," Derek challenged. "Show me your discharge papers, tell me your unit. Give me the name of one person who served with you, just one." Bobby's hand shook slightly as he placed his cap back on his head. He looked one more time at the memorial, then at Derek, then at the crowd of people who had gone from celebrating heroes to questioning one. "I'm sorry you feel this way," he said to Derek. "I hope you never have to understand why some things are hard to talk about." With that, Bobby walked away, his shoulders hunched and his steps slower than when he'd arrived. The crowd parted to let him through, but no one spoke. The only sound was his old pickup truck starting up and driving away, leaving behind a cloud of confusion and uncomfortable questions. Derek stood there looking triumphant, his chest puffed out with pride. "That's how you handle stolen valor, folks," he announced to the crowd. "Real veterans deserve better than to have their honor stolen by fakes and phonies." But as the crowd began to disperse, not everyone was convinced. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore shook her head sadly. Old Jim Patterson from the hardware store frowned and walked away without a word. Something about the whole confrontation felt wrong to them, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what. The Memorial Day celebration continued, but the joy had gone out of it. The incident would be talked about for weeks to come, dividing the town and setting in motion events that would change everything Bobby Martinez thought he knew about keeping the past buried. By Tuesday morning, everyone in Millbrook had heard about what happened at the Memorial Day ceremony. The story spread like wildfire through the small town of 8,000 people, growing and changing with each telling. Some folks said Derek Walsh was a hero for exposing a fake veteran. Others whispered that he'd gone too far, bullying an old man who'd never hurt anyone. The argument started early at Rosie's Diner on Main Street, where the coffee was strong and the opinions were stronger. Rosie Martinez had owned the place for 15 years, serving breakfast to half the town before they headed off to work. She'd known Bobby since he first moved to Millbrook, and she didn't like what she was hearing. "That man has been coming in here twice a week for over 10 years, Rosie told anyone who would listen. "Never caused trouble, always said please and thank you. Left good tips even when I could tell money was tight. You don't treat people like that based on suspicion." But not everyone agreed. Frank Wilson, who owned the hardware store down the Iowa street, shook his head as he stirred sugar into his coffee. "I don't know, Rosie. Something always seemed off about him. Real veterans like to talk about their service, share stories with other vets. Bobby never said a word about the war." "Maybe he had good reasons," Rosie shot back. "Maybe some things are too hard to talk about." The debate continued throughout the morning rush, with customers taking sides and voices getting louder. By the time lunch rolled around, two distinct camps had formed in Millbrook. Those who supported Derek's actions called themselves the Truth Seekers. Those who defended Bobby became known as the Old Guard. Derek Walsh wasn't content to let the matter rest. That evening, he posted a long message on the Millbrook Community Facebook page. where most of the town's gossip and news got shared. His post had over 300 reactions within the first hour. Yesterday, I confronted a man who has been lying to our community for years, Derek wrote. Stolen valor is not just about wearing fake medals or patches. It's about stealing the honor and respect that belongs to real veterans who bled and died for our freedom. As someone who served this country, I cannot and will not stand by while phonies parade around in costumes, disrespecting the memory of true heroes. The comments section exploded. Derek's supporters praised him for his courage and demanded that Bobby prove his service or leave town. But others pushed back, questioning whether Derek had any real evidence or was just making assumptions. Lucy Patterson, who taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary, wrote a long response defending Bobby. This man helped my elderly mother clear snow from her driveway every winter for 3 years. He never asked for payment, never wanted recognition. He just showed up with his shovel and did the work. That's not the behavior of someone seeking attention or fake honor. But Derek's most vocal supporter was Rita Thompson, whose son had been killed in Afghanistan 5 years earlier. Her grief had turned into fierce protectiveness of military honor, and she saw Bobby as a direct insult to her son's memory. My Danny died fighting for this country, she posted. He was 19 years old and had his whole life ahead of him. I will not sit quietly while some old man plays dress-up and mocks my son's sacrifice. The online argument raged for hours, with neighbors who had been friends for decades suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of a bitter divide. Screenshots of the debate were shared on other social media platforms, and soon, people from neighboring towns were weighing in with their own opinions. Meanwhile, Bobby Martinez had disappeared from public view. The bookstore owner, Helen Chen, lived in the apartment next to Bobby's and could hear him moving around at all hours of the night. She knocked on his door several times to check on him, but he only opened it a crack and said he was fine before closing it again. He looks terrible, Helen confided to her sister during their weekly phone call. Like he's aged 10 years in 3 days. I've never seen someone look so defeated. Bobby stopped going to his regular places around town. He didn't show up at the diner for his usual Tuesday breakfast or his Friday lunch. The barber shop where he got his hair cut once a month didn't see him. Even the small grocery store on Elm Street where he did his weekly shopping went without his familiar face. The absence only made people more suspicious. See? Derek told his friends at Murphy's Tavern on Wednesday night. If he had nothing to hide, he'd be out defending himself. Guilty people run and hide. But Helen Chen saw a different side of the story. She watched from her window as Bobby paced his small apartment late into the night, sometimes stopping to stare out at the street below. She could see him talking to himself, his hands moving as if he was having an argument with invisible people. It reminded her of her grandfather, who had fought in World War II and sometimes had nightmares that made him wake up shouting. On Thursday morning, things got worse. Someone had spray-painted the word fraud on the side of Bobby's old pickup truck. Helen discovered it when she went out to get her morning paper and immediately called the police. Chief Rodriguez arrived within 20 minutes, but the message was clear enough for anyone to see. This has gone too far, Helen told the police chief. This is harassment, plain and simple. But Chief Rodriguez was in a difficult position. He'd served in the Marines himself and understood the anger about stolen valor. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that someone had committed vandalism on private property. I'll file a report, he promised Helen, but unless Bobby wants to press charges or come forward to clear this up, there's not much more I can do. The vandalism story spread quickly, and it only deepened the divide in town. Derek's supporters claimed they had nothing to do with it, but said Bobby deserved whatever he got for lying to the community. Bobby's defenders were outraged and demanded that someone be arrested. That Friday evening, Derek organized what he called a Stolen Valor Awareness meeting at the community center. He put up flyers around town and sent invitations to every veteran and military family he could find. The meeting was supposed to educate people about the problem of fake veterans and how to spot them. Over 60 people showed up, filling the small meeting room to capacity. Derek stood at the front with a laptop and projector, presenting what he claimed was evidence of Bobby's deception. "I've been researching military records," Derek announced to the crowd. "And I can't find any trace of Robert Martinez serving in any Army unit during the Vietnam War. No discharge papers, no service record, nothing." The crowd murmured and whispered. Some people nodded in agreement while others looked uncomfortable with the public trial of a man who wasn't there to defend himself. Eddie Reeves, a Vietnam veteran who had lost his left leg in combat, raised his hand. "Derek, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but military records from that era are complicated. A lot of stuff is still classified or got lost over the years. Just because you can't find something online doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Derek's face flushed red. "Are you defending him, Eddie? A man who's been lying to your face for years?" "I'm not defending anybody," Eddie replied calmly. "I'm just saying we should be careful about jumping to conclusions without all the facts." The RIOI meeting continued for another hour, but it solved nothing. If anything, it made the divisions in town even deeper. People left that night more convinced than ever that they were right, and everyone else was wrong. Bobby Martinez never came to defend himself. He stayed in his apartment, alone with whatever memories or secrets had kept him quiet for so many years. The truth about his service remained locked away, while the town of Millbrook tore itself apart trying to decide whether he was a hero or a fraud. The answer would come soon enough, but not from any source that Derek Walsh or his supporters could have imagined. Eleanor Whitman had taught history at Millbrook High School for 37 years before retiring, and she knew how to research better than most people in town. The whole Bobby Martinez situation bothered her more each day. She'd seen too many witch hunts in her lifetime to feel comfortable with what was happening to the quiet old man. On Saturday morning, Eleanor drove to the county courthouse in the next town over. She'd helped students with research projects there dozens of times and knew her way around the public records. If Derek Walsh could play detective, so could she. "I'm looking for military service records for Robert Martinez," she told the clerk, a young woman who looked barely old enough to vote. "Birth date?" the clerk asked, typing on her computer. Eleanor had done her homework. She'd found Bobby's address in the phone book and cross-referenced it with voter registration records. Born March 15, 1954. Enlisted sometime around 1972, I think. The computer screen flickered as the clerk searched. After a few minutes, she frowned. "I'm showing an enlistment record from 1972, but most of his file is restricted access. Says, here it requires special clearance to view." Eleanor's eyebrows went up. "Restricted? What does that mean?" "Usually means the service involved classified operations or sensitive information," the clerk explained. "I can give you the basic info that's public. Enlistment date, discharge date, and that he receives VA disability benefits. But the details of his service are blocked." Eleanor wrote down what little information she could get. Robert Martinez had enlisted on June 3, 1972 at age 18. He was discharged in December 1975. That was almost 4 years of service, longer than Derek's National Guard stint, and he was receiving disability payments from the Veterans Administration, which meant the government recognized his service. But the restricted file only raised more questions. What kind of service required that level of secrecy, even 50 years later? Eleanor spent the rest of Saturday at the library, using their computers to search military history websites. She learned that many special operations records from the Vietnam era remained classified due to sensitive missions that crossed international borders. Some units operated so secretly that their existence wasn't acknowledged for decades. While Eleanor researched, Derek Walsh was conducting his own investigation. He'd contacted several online military record services and was convinced he'd found proof of Bobby's deception. On Sunday morning, Derek called his friend Rick Murphy with excitement in his voice. "I found it, Rick. I found the smoking gun." "What are you talking about?" Rick asked, still groggy from sleep. "Bobby Martinez's so-called unit, the 173rd Special Operations Group. I searched everywhere, and guess what? It never existed. There was no 173rd SOG during Vietnam. I've got him now." Derek spent the rest of Sunday preparing what he called his final evidence against Bobby. He printed out pages from military websites, highlighted sections about known special operations units, and prepared a presentation that he planned to deliver at the next town council meeting. But Derek's research had a flaw. In his eagerness to prove Bobby wrong, he'd missed crucial details about how classified units operated. Many special operations groups used cover designations that weren't their real unit names. Others had their numbers changed or completely erased from public records for security reasons. Monday morning brought another development. Dr. Patricia Hall, who ran the small medical clinic on the edge of town, had been thinking about Bobby all weekend. She'd treated him twice over the years, once for a severe back injury and another time for what looked like an anxiety attack. During both visits, she'd noticed old scars on his body that looked like they came from serious injuries. There were marks on his wrists that could have been from restraints, and a long scar across his ribs that suggested a knife wound. At the time, she hadn't asked questions, but now she wondered if those injuries told a story. Dr. Hall called Eleanor Whitman that afternoon. "Eleanor, I know you've been looking into Bobby's background. I can't share medical details, but I can tell you that man has physical scars consistent with combat injuries and possibly torture." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "Torture?" "I've seen similar injuries in refugees from war zones," Dr. Hall explained. "The kind of scars that come from being held prisoner and abused. It might explain why he doesn't like to talk about his service." That evening, Eleanor decided to visit Bobby directly. She climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment above the bookstore and knocked on his door. After a long pause, Bobby opened it just a crack, the same way he'd been doing with everyone lately. "Mr. Martinez, my name is Eleanor Whitman. I'm a retired teacher, and I'd like to talk with you about what's been happening." Bobby started to close the door, but Eleanor spoke quickly. "I've been doing some research on your military service. I know about the classified records. I know you're receiving VA disability benefits, and I know Derek Walsh is planning to present what he thinks is evidence against you at the town council meeting Thursday night." The door stopped closing. Bobby's tired eyes met Eleanor's through the narrow gap. "Why do you care?" he asked quietly. "Because I've lived in this town for 40 years and I've never seen people turn on someone so cruelly based on nothing but suspicion," Eleanor replied. "And because I think there's more to your story than anyone realizes." Bobby was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened the door wider and stepped aside to let Eleanor in. His apartment was small and neat, with military precision in how everything was arranged. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of 8 young soldiers in jungle fatigues. Bobby looked impossibly young in the picture, maybe 19 or 20 years old. "That was my team," Bobby said, noticing Eleanor looking at the photo. "Only 3 of us made it home." Eleanor felt her heart break a little. What happened to the others? Bobby sat down heavily in an old recliner that had seen better days. "We weren't supposed to be where we were. Officially, we were never there. The missions we ran, the places we went, none of it existed on paper." "Laos?" Eleanor asked gently. "Cambodia?" Bobby nodded. "Places American soldiers weren't supposed to be. We did reconnaissance mostly. Went deep behind enemy lines to gather intelligence. Sometimes we'd be out there for weeks at a time, just the 8 of us." "What happened to you, Bobby?" "Got captured on my last mission," he said, his voice getting quieter. "Spent 7 months in a bamboo cage barely big enough to lie down in. When I finally got out, the war was over, and everyone just wanted to forget it ever happened." Eleanor understood now why Bobby's records were classified. The operations he'd been part of were so sensitive that acknowledging them might cause international incidents even today. "Derek Walsh is going to present his evidence Thursday night," Eleanor warned. "He thinks he's found proof that your unit never existed." Bobby laughed bitterly. "In a way, he's right. Officially, we never did exist. That was the whole point." "Will you come to the meeting? Will you defend yourself?" Bobby shook his head. "I've kept quiet for 50 years. I'm not about to start talking now." Eleanor left Bobby's apartment with a heavy heart. She knew the truth now, but she also knew that Bobby wasn't going to speak up for himself. The classified nature of his service meant she couldn't prove anything without official help, and that seemed unlikely to come. Thursday night arrived faster than anyone wanted. The town council meeting was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Derek Walsh sat in the front row with his folder of evidence, looking confident and pleased with himself. Bobby Martinez wasn't there. He'd stayed in his apartment, probably listening to the angry voices drifting up from the street below. The truth was locked away in classified files and painful memories, while the town prepared to judge him based on incomplete information and wounded pride. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, but not in the way anyone expected. The black sedan with government plates pulled into Millbrook on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after Bobby Martinez collapsed from stress and spent 2 days in the county hospital. Most folks in town had heard about the collapse, but opinions remained divided about whether it proved his guilt or his innocence. The car was a Crown Victoria, the kind federal agents and high-ranking military officials preferred. Its windows were tinted dark enough that nobody could see inside, and it moved through the quiet streets with purpose. Several people noticed it as it passed, but small towns see strange cars all the time. Nobody thought much of it until the driver parked in front of Rosie's diner and stepped out. The man who emerged was in his early 70s but carried himself like someone half that age. His silver hair was cut military short, and his steel-gray eyes swept the street with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen the world's dangerous places. He wore a simple dark suit, but everything about him screamed authority and command, presence. Inside the diner, conversation stopped when he walked through the door. Rosie Martinez looked up from the coffee pot she was refilling and felt something stir in her memory. This man looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Good morning," the stranger said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm looking for a man named Robert Martinez, Bobby Martinez. I understand he lives somewhere in this town." Rosie set down the coffee pot carefully. "May I ask who's looking for him?" The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flashing an ID too quickly for anyone to read the details. "General James Morrison, retired. I need to speak with Sergeant Martinez about an urgent matter." The title General rippled through the diner like electricity. Suddenly, every customer was straining to hear the conversation while pretending to focus on their breakfast. "He lives above the bookstore on Main Street," Rosie said quietly. "But he's been keeping to himself lately. There's been some trouble, General." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something cold flashed behind his eyes. "What kind of trouble?" Frank Wilson, who owned the hardware store and had been vocal in supporting Derek Walsh, spoke up from his corner booth. "There's been questions about his military service. Some folks think he might be lying about being a veteran." The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. General Morrison turned slowly to face Frank, and the older man suddenly wished he'd kept his mouth shut. "Questions," the general repeated, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow more frightening than a shout. "What kind of questions?" Frank swallowed hard. "Well, nobody's ever seen proof that he actually served. He doesn't go to veteran meetings, doesn't talk about the war. Derek Walsh, he's a local veteran, and he thinks maybe Bobby's been lying about the whole thing." General Morrison was quiet for so long that the silence became uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, "Where can I find this Derek Walsh?" "He owns Walsh Motors about 6 blocks down Main Street," Frank replied, suddenly wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. The general nodded once, sharp and military. "Thank you." He turned back to Rosie. "The bookstore you said?" "Yes, sir. Helen Chen owns it. Bobby's apartment is upstairs." General Morrison left the diner without another word. Behind him, the customers erupted in whispered conversations about who he might be and what his arrival meant for Bobby Martinez. The general found the bookstore easily enough. It was a small, cluttered place with narrow aisles and books stacked floor to ceiling. Helen Chen looked up from behind the counter as he entered, her eyes widening at his commanding presence. "I'm looking for Robert Martinez," he said simply. "He's upstairs," Helen replied, then hesitated. "Are you here about the trouble he's been having?" "In a way." The general's expression softened slightly. "How has he been?" "Not good," Helen admitted. "He barely sleeps, barely eats. Whatever happened to him in the war, this whole situation has brought it all back. Sometimes I hear him talking to himself, arguing with people who aren't there. General Morrison nodded grimly. That would be consistent with his psychological profile. May I go up? Helen pointed to a narrow staircase at the back of the store. Second door on the left. The general climbed the stairs with measured steps, his shoes silent on the old wooden boards. He paused outside Bobby's door for a moment, as if preparing himself for what he might find inside. Then he knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the narrow hallway. The door opened slowly, and Bobby Martinez appeared in the gap. When he saw who was standing in his hallway, all the color drained from his face. His knees actually buckled, and he had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. "Hello, Sergeant," General Morrison said quietly. "We need to talk." Bobby stared at him like he was seeing a ghost. "General Morrison? Sir, why are you—" "May I come in, Bobby?" Bobby stepped aside wordlessly, his hands shaking as he closed the door behind them. His small apartment suddenly felt even smaller with the general's commanding presence filling the space. General Morrison looked around the Spartan room, taking in the military precision of how everything was arranged, the single photograph of 8 young soldiers and the man who had once been one of his best operatives now reduced to a shadow of himself. "Jesus, Bobby," the general said, his formal bearing slipping for a moment. "What have they done to you?" Bobby collapsed into his old recliner, his hands covering his face. "How did you know, sir? How did you find me?" "The VA flagged your medical records when you were hospitalized last week. Severe stress reaction, they said. When I saw the address, I knew something was wrong. You've been off the grid for 50 years, Bobby. What could be bad enough to put you in the hospital?" Bobby laughed bitterly. "They think I'm a fraud, General. They think I made up my service, bought my medals at a surplus store. There's a man here, Derek Walsh, who's been telling the whole town that I'm a fake veteran." General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "They questioned your service record." "My what service record?" Bobby asked. "According to them, there is no record. The 123rd SOG never existed, they say. We were ghosts, remember? Officially, we were never in Laos or Cambodia. Officially, none of it ever happened." The general stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the small town street below. 50 years, Bobby. 50 years you've carried this alone. You never reached out, never asked for help. What was I supposed to say? That I spent 18 months running black ops across the border? That I got half my team killed on missions? That never officially happened? That I spent 7 months being tortured by people whose country we weren't supposed to be in? General Morrison turned back to face him. You were supposed to say that you served your country with honor and distinction, that you completed missions no one else could handle, that you sacrificed your youth, your health, and your peace of mind for operations that helped end a war. Bobby's voice broke. Nobody wants to hear that story, General. They want heroes who can talk about their service without breaking down. They want veterans who come home and adjust and live normal lives. They don't want to hear about bamboo cages and dead friends and missions that officially never happened. General Morrison's jaw tightened. Where did you say I could find this Derek Walsh? Bobby looked up in alarm. General, please don't make this worse than it already is. Worse? The general's voice rose for the first time. Bobby, you are one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command. You completed 17 classified missions behind enemy lines. You saved countless American lives by gathering intelligence that our regular forces could never have obtained. And some small-town wannabe hero is calling you a fraud? Bobby stood up shakily. Sir, with respect, it doesn't matter what the truth is. These people have made up their minds. If you make a scene, it'll just prove to them that I'm desperate. Enough to hire an actor to play General. General Morrison walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Bobby, I've been keeping track of your team over the years. Danny Rodriguez died in a car accident in 1982. Mike Thompson took his own life in 1995. Kenny Walsh, no relation to your tormentor here, died of cancer 3 years ago. That leaves you, me, and 2 others from the original group. He turned, back to face Bobby. We lost too many good men in those jungles for me to let some ignorant civilian destroy the reputation of one of our survivors. You may have forgotten who you are, Sergeant Martinez, but I haven't. The general opened the door. I'll be back in an hour. Get cleaned up and put on your uniform. It's time this town learned the truth about the man they've been tormenting. Bobby started to protest, but General Morrison was already gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he headed back to the street. Through his window, Bobby watched the general walk toward his car with the purposeful stride of a man going to war. The distance, Walsh Motors sat unknowing and unprepared for the storm that was about to hit it. Word spread through Millbrook faster than a summer wildfire. A real general had come to town, and he was looking for Bobby Martinez. By the time General Morrison's black sedan pulled up in front of Walsh Motors, half the town seemed to be finding reasons to walk past the car dealership. Derek Walsh was in his office when his secretary knocked on the door. "Derek, there's a man here to see you. Says he's a general." Derek looked up from the paperwork on his desk, a confident smile spreading across his face. "A general? Well, send him in. I bet he heard about our stolen valor problem and came to congratulate us on exposing that fraud." Derek straightened his tie and put on his best businessman smile as General Morrison walked into his office. The smile faded quickly when he saw the expression on the general's face. This wasn't a man coming to offer congratulations. "You Derek Walsh?" the general asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Yes, sir, that's me. Derek Walsh, owner of Walsh Motors and proud veteran of the United States National Guard. I assume you're here about the Bobby Martinez situation?" General Morrison closed the office door behind him with deliberate care. "Oh yes, Mr. Walsh. I'm definitely here about Bobby Martinez." Outside, people had started gathering in the parking lot. Someone had posted on Facebook that a general was confronting Derek, and curious townspeople were arriving to see what would happen. Eleanor Whitman stood near the front of the crowd, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Inside the office, Derek was still trying to control the conversation. "I have to say, General, I'm impressed that word of our investigation reached the military. It just shows how seriously we take the problem of stolen valor here in Millbrook." "Your investigation?" General Morrison repeated slowly, his gray eyes never leaving Derek's face. "Tell me about this investigation, Mr. Walsh." Derek opened his filing cabinet and pulled out the folder he'd been preparing for weeks. "I've documented everything, sir. Robert Martinez claims to have served in a unit called the 173rd Special Operations Group during Vietnam. But here's the thing. I've searched every database, every military website, every record I could find. That unit never existed." The general looked at the papers Derek handed him, flipping through printouts and highlighted sections with growing disgust. "And based on this research, you concluded that Sergeant Martinez was lying about his service?" "Absolutely," Derek said proudly. "I confronted him publicly on Memorial Day. The man couldn't provide a single piece of evidence to support his claims. Real veterans don't hide from questions about their service." General Morrison set the papers down on Derek's desk. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow that made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Mr. Walsh, in your 4 years of National Guard service, did you ever deploy overseas?" Derek's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, no, sir. We were never called up for deployment, but I trained with weapons, did my annual requirements. Did you ever see combat?" "No, sir, but did you ever have to kill an enemy soldier to protect your teammates?" Derek was getting uncomfortable now. "General, I don't see what this has to do with. Did you ever spend months behind enemy lines eating bugs and drinking muddy water, watching your friends die one by one?" The office had gone completely silent except for the general's voice, which seemed to fill every corner of the room. "Ray, you ever spend 7 months in a bamboo cage barely big enough to lie down in, being beaten and starved and tortured every single day?" Derek's face had gone pale. "General, did you ever escape from that cage weighing 93 pounds covered in infected wounds and crawl through 20 miles of jungle to reach friendly forces?" General Morrison stood up from his chair, his full authority filling the small office. "Because that's exactly what Sergeant Robert Martinez did, and you, Mr. Walsh, publicly humiliated him for it." Through the office windows, the crowd outside had grown to over 50 people. Everyone was straining to hear what was being said inside, but the words were muffled by the glass. Derek tried to salvage the situation. "General, with all due respect, if that's true, then why aren't there any records? Why can't anyone verify?" "His service?" General Morrison's laugh was cold and bitter. "Records? You want records, Mr. Walsh? Let me explain something about classified operations. The unit that Sergeant Martinez served in was so secret that it officially didn't exist. The missions they ran were so sensitive that acknowledging them could have caused international incidents." The general walked to the window, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. Bobby Martinez and his team conducted reconnaissance missions deep behind enemy lines in Laos and Cambodia. Officially, American forces were never in those countries. Officially, those missions never happened. Officially, that unit never existed. Derek's voice was barely a whisper now. "But the databases..." "Your databases show what they're supposed to show," General Morrison snapped. "Cover stories and false designations designed to protect the real operations. Did you really think the government would put classified special operations units on public websites for amateur detectives to find?" The general turned back to face Derek, his eyes blazing with anger. Sergeant Martinez completed 17 missions behind enemy lines. He gathered intelligence that saved hundreds of American lives. He was captured, tortured, and left for dead. When he finally escaped and made it back to our lines, he weighed less than 100 pounds and had injuries that still cause him pain 50 years later. Derek tried to speak, but General Morrison wasn't finished. The psychological evaluation after his rescue recommended extensive therapy for what we now call PTSD. The doctor said he would probably never be able to talk about his experiences without reliving the trauma. And you, Mr. Walsh, forced him to relive that trauma in front of his entire community. By now, people outside were taking pictures and recording videos with their phones. Someone had called the local newspaper, and the reporter was pushing through the crowd trying to get closer to the windows. General Morrison walked to the office door and opened it. "I think this conversation would benefit from a larger audience. Don't you?" Derek tried to protest, but the general was already walking outside. The crowd parted as he stepped into the parking lot, his commanding presence making everyone step back respectfully. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot, "I understand you've been having a debate about whether Robert Martinez is a real veteran or a fraud. I'm here to settle that debate once and for all." Bobby Martinez had appeared at the edge of the crowd, wearing his old army uniform that still fit his thin frame. He looked terrified but determined, standing straight despite the tremor in his hands. General Morrison's voice rose as he addressed the crowd. "This man served his country with distinction in some of the most dangerous operations of the Vietnam War. His unit was classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The missions he completed were so sensitive that most of them remain classified to this day." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Sergeant Martinez was captured by enemy forces and spent 7 months as a prisoner of war. He was tortured, starved, and left for dead in conditions that would have broken most men. When he finally escaped, he crawled through 20 miles of hostile jungle to reach safety. General Morrison turned to look at Derek, who had followed him outside and now stood looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. "This man has lived with the psychological wounds of that experience for 50 years. His reluctance to discuss his service wasn't suspicious. It was the natural response of someone who had endured unimaginable trauma in service to his country." The general's voice began to shake with emotion. "And you people, his neighbors and fellow citizens, chose to believe the worst about him based on nothing but ignorance and prejudice." Eleanor Whitman stepped forward from the crowd. "General, we didn't know. If someone had just explained..." General Morrison's voice rose to a shout. "Sergeant Martinez didn't owe you an explanation. His service record is classified, his medical information is private, and his trauma is his own to bear. The fact that he couldn't prove his service to your satisfaction doesn't make him a fraud. It makes his service even more valuable to this country." The general walked over to where Bobby stood and came to attention, rendering a perfect military salute. "Sergeant Robert Martinez, It has been my honor to serve alongside you and my privilege to call you one of the finest soldiers I have ever known." Bobby returned the salute with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. For the first time in weeks, he stood fully upright, his military bearing returning as the weight of shame and suspicion lifted from his shoulders. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to thunderous applause that echoed off the buildings. Around the parking lot, Derek Walsh stood alone near his office door, his face red with shame and embarrassment. In the days that followed, Millbrook transformed its treatment of Bobby Martinez. Derek Walsh, humbled by the revelation, led a community-wide effort to apologize and make amends. The town organized a proper recognition ceremony, and Bobby, while still private about the details of his service, began to heal from the wounds that had been reopened by the controversy.